Thank you for coming, and now let me present our special guest. He is a person held in very high esteem in our country because he's a person of ideas. His academic background is extraordinary and very, very impressive indeed. He is a person concerned about our future. How do we address our problems in ways that various factions can come together and support? We're a nation in crisis. Thoughtful people understand that of whatever political or philosophical persuasion. His mission is to try and find a way to bring us together so that whatever we do in the best interest of America and in the future of our children and our grandchildren. He's an exceptional writer, syndicated in more than 50 newspapers, is heard weekly on National Public Radio. Will you welcome, please, a very special human being, the one and only Matthew Miller.
Thank you very much, George. Boy, I sounded so sober and worthy in that introduction. I'm sure I'll never be able to live up to that. And in some ways, I don't want to be too sober-minded and worthy. There are serious topics we're going to discuss, but I hope in a compelling way. I should first thank you, George, because the work you do at the City Club and the great convening that you do in this town and in Denver. Do people know you have this secret double life in Denver? Is terrific. The Mitrovich Empire extends far and wide, and I'm glad to see so many friends and friendly faces in the group. I am perhaps like you. I'm a native of Los Angeles, so the last week or so since the Schwarzenegger earthquake, I'm still in need of a little bit of therapy, so we may have a moment of at least collective therapy up front. The whole fact of the recall and then Arnold's winning, Arnold, because you can feel that kind of sense of intimacy of his first name because he's a celebrity in The Terminator and a man whose movies we all know. I don't know about you, but as a Democrat, even though this is a book that's trying to bring people together, when I saw the tableau on CNN that night where you had Maria Shriver and all these Kennedys lined up toasting the installment of a Republican governor in California, it just struck me as somewhat surreal, and then I couldn't help having my mind flash forward to the idea that come next year, and this is right after today in the papers, you saw pictures of President Bush and Governor-elect Schwarzenegger meeting and at least beginning the tango of, will the feds help California, what will Schwarzenegger do for Arnold, is to contemplate that in 2004, does Maria Shriver have to go out stumping for George Bush to get reelected? And is that something that's really going to go down in Hyannisport? Or will Arnold and Maria become the sort of West Coast version of James Carville and Mary Madeline at some point? It's just, it's hard to fathom. Then I'm in the middle of what's about a 15-city book tour and was in Washington State, I guess the day before yesterday, and it starts to blur after a while. The day before yesterday, and I was at the Daniel Evans School of Public Policy at the University of Washington. Daniel Evans being one of the great moderate Republicans of his era there, who inspired many of the people who I actually met there. But when I saw the placard calling it the Daniel Evans School for Public Policy, I thought one other thing that is now inevitable and still seems kind of surreal to behold is that sometime within the next 5 or 10 years, there will be at Cal State, one of the Cal States, or the University of California, could be right in a campus here in town, the Arnold Schwarzenegger School of Public Policy. And that's just a fascinating thing to behold. Now, and it's not, and by the way, I'm very hopeful about Arnold. I'm a Democrat, I voted against the recall. I have to give the obligatory caveat, not because I like Ray Davis, I didn't like Ray Davis that much, but the idea that I felt the recall was a hijacking of the process and, what kind of a state are we in if we can put $2 million gets anything on the ballot like this. But having said that, the fact that Arnold, I think, has an opportunity because he remains on policy such a blank slate because he was able to get elected without laying out many of the kinds of choices you'd have to make to govern, still leaves me hopeful that he will be a moderate Republican, someone who, if he chose to, if he governed in a kind of Rockefeller Republican-esque kind of way, could rehabilitate that brand of republicanism that, in my view, has been missing from national politics for the last 10 years or so. And if he did it, it could be enormously beneficial for the state and for the country and really change the whole national debate. So I'm trying to feel hopeful at this moment in feeling that Arnold may represent some kind of a fresh start for the state, which, as all of you know, has faced some long-standing and intractable problems. And in a way, the whole spirit of fresh start is what I'm trying to do with this book in terms of the national discussion and in terms of national policy. Now, I've been told as I make the rounds trying to interest folks in the book that the whole idea of a book called the 2% Solution is deeply countercultural. Most other books on the political bookshelf that you'll see right now are either accusing someone or other of being a liar or treasonous or scandalous or something like that. And this instead is saying we can actually have a solution. So people say you're really cutting against the grain. Then second, it's even more deeply countercultural, I'm told, to have a solution that I think liberals, fixing America's problems in ways that liberals and conservatives can love, which is the subtitle of the book. Don't I know, people say, that this is, we're a nation of partisan sniping and all we can do is continue the kind of blood sport in Washington that, as we know, dominates the headlines and frustrates lots of us who see gridlock and blame games and finger pointing, and yet I'm trying to cut a little bit against that spirit. The whole question of trying to do this in ways that bring both sides together reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from Ambrose Bierce, who wrote this wonderful book called The Devil's Dictionary many, many years ago that some of you may be familiar with. And Ambrose Bierce has a wonderful, witty definition there of a conservative. And a liberal gets into it as well. Ambrose Bierce defines a conservative as a statesman who is enamored of existing evils. A statesman who is enamored of existing evils as opposed to the liberal who wishes to replace them with new ones. Now, that whole juxtaposition, I think, suggests the proper level of humility that all of us need to bring to the whole question of trying to move public problems forward, as I know many of you in this room are probably concerned with as we try and figure out how to head forward as a nation and address some of our biggest domestic problems. Let me start by talking about luck. And when I say luck, I'm talking about what people sometimes refer to as the pre-birth lottery. By that I mean the inherited package of wealth, brains, genes, talents, skills, health, and lack of those things that each of us comes into the world with, and that, if we're honest, I think, each of us would say has a lot to do with where people end up in life. Now, I'll tell you in a minute what Milton Friedman said to me about luck when I talked to him for a couple of hours about it. This was the very well-known conservative economist, Nobel Prize winner, who now is retired in San Francisco, but still very active. I'll tell you what Bill Bennett said to me about luck when I talked to him about it for the book. If you've been following the news, you know that Bennett later had some other run-ins with luck that I won't get into. And I will also tell you what the American people said in a poll that I commissioned for the book that dealt partly with this question of luck. But to get a feel for a group, I like to ask at the outset a question, which is, if you had to say which matters most in terms of where people end up in life, and you have two choices. One is luck, the way I've described it, the pre-birth lottery, the inherited wealth, health, skills, brains, genes, early education, because that depends on sort of what family you're born into. All of these things, of course, that we can neither take credit for nor be blamed for. It's just what happened. So luck on the one hand, or on the other, individual effort, personal initiative, hard work, individual character. Those are the two choices. Now, obviously, that's a cardboard choice. I know that. In every life, there's some of both. We come into the world with some set of things that we're endowed with by just virtue of where we're born. And then we also make the most of it, depending on our character and individual effort, et cetera. But if you had to say which one matters most for where people end up in life, how many people would say, by a show of hands, what I'm calling luck? Pretty broad sea of hands. How many people would say, by a show of hands, individual effort, hard work, personal initiative? A much smaller group, but a committed group. Now, please understand, I'm not arguing against hard work. I'm a hard worker myself. Obviously, this is a bit of a cardboard choice, but you might be interested to know, based on the poll that I took, that this would suggest, just based on the show of hands in the room, that this is a room largely of people who would identify themselves as Democrats. In the poll that I took, people who self-identify as Democrats or liberals tended to pick luck as the thing that matters most. In the poll that I did, people who self-identified as Republicans or conservatives tended to view hard work or character. Again, it's a difficult choice, but that's the way they would come down. And in a sign that, at least if I wear a partisan hat for a second as a Democrat, that I viewed as hopeful, is independent voters tended to view luck the way Democrats view luck, which was interesting. Now, Bill Bennett, when I asked him about luck, said very straightforwardly, he said, is family part of what you're calling luck? I said, yes. Are genes part of what you're calling luck? I said, yes. He goes, luck, no question. Milton Friedman has always had a much more complicated relationship with the whole notion of luck. Back in 1952, so this is a half century ago, when he was a young 40-year-old economist, not known to anyone like he is now globally, but a rising star in the economics profession, Friedman wrote a paper called Chance, Choice, and the Distribution of Income, where he went to great lengths to try and prove mathematically that what I'm calling luck isn't as important in the economic outcomes we observe in the world as many of us in this room, at least, would presumptively intuit. So, for example, he would say the individual's tastes and choices and preferences may have as much to do with the kind of distribution of income we see, so that someone who, for example, chooses to bask in the sun all day long will not make as much money as someone who chooses to be a school superintendent or a judge or a doctor or a lawyer or gainfully employed. And of course, Friedman is right. But what he extrapolated from that, and which he really tried to show through the kind of equations that economists were using even back then, is that luck is not as important as we think in terms of what we see in terms of economic outcomes. Now, why was he at such great pains to do that a half century ago, really at the dawn of his rise? He doesn't say so in this paper, but I think that his anxiety was plain. If you're a free market economist, you can't let luck in the door this way, because if you think luck really does have as much to do, what I'm calling luck, has as much to do with where people end up in life, then you also begin to think that maybe society ought to do more, or something more, to ameliorate some of the burdens of bad luck. And if you're a free market economist, letting luck in that way puts you on the slippery slope towards socialism and egalitarianism and a bunch of economy-killing incentives, you fear, that could kill the golden goose that gives us the economic growth that lets us do lots of things that we want to do that actually address some of this luck stuff. Now, why am I starting with luck? I believe, and this is under the influence of the late, great liberal philosopher John Rawls, who some of you may have come across in your studies in college or along the way. He was a Harvard political philosopher who wrote a great book called The Theory of Justice about 30 years ago. I believe that if we took luck seriously, it would be the beginning of how we could reach consensus across the political spectrum on the kinds of things that ought to be front and center in terms of our domestic priorities in ways they have not been in at least a decade. And that if we start with this idea of luck, as opposed to the invariably controversial choices and options about taxes and spending and programs, etc., it would give us a different window into a way to come together. Rawls asked us to imagine, he had this famous thought experiment where he said, imagine yourself in some original position, he called it, before we're born, when we have no idea where we're going to end up in the world, whether we're going to be born rich or poor, or black or white, or brown or yellow, in Boston or Baghdad, to a family that provides a good education or a poor one. And in that original position, when we don't know where we're going to end up, behind what he called famously a veil of ignorance, he said that was the right place to think about what the rules of the game ought to be in society, how we would organize life in a community in a way that all of us would agree was just. And he said if we thought about things from that point of view, prior to when we're in the world, so we don't know what particular stake we have in how things are set up, he said we would be driven to two fundamental commitments. The first would be a serious commitment to equal opportunity, so that no matter where you came out in the world, you could rise. And the second would be a commitment to a minimally decent life for citizens of a wealthy nation like the United States. And in a funny way, over the past several years, as I've reported and researched this book, I have been a kind of shuttle diplomat between George Bush's cabinet, between the Democratic presidential contenders, the politicos and gurus who advise all of them, some of our nation's superintendents who run the biggest city school districts, including Mr. Burson here, and his colleagues like Roy Romer or Howard Levy in New York, and Arnie Duncan, the people who run the teachers' unions, because they're involved, obviously, in a major way in the way school districts are run, the editors of the Washington Post and the New York Times, because there's a huge media angle to what it will take to improve the public discussion we need so that citizens can actually do their job and demand straighter talk and more common sense answers from our leaders. But I've been on this kind of journey to try and see if we can't pull both sides together around an agenda that would help us get serious about these commitments to equal opportunity and a minimally decent life, resulting in the package that I'll give you some detail on in a second. Now, I have to say this has not been an unfun journey. I spent about 45 minutes one night in Washington with James Carville, the political consultant that you know, at a restaurant that he owns in D.C. He's kind of a multi-industry entity at this point, Mr. Carville is. And after I gave him the lengthy pitch on the 2% solution that I will give you a somewhat shorter version of in a minute, he's nodding his head, and I can't do a good Southern accent, but he says, this is great, all this money and focus on the working poor, which is most of what the book is about. He says, but you really need to make this a 3% solution because health care always costs more than you think. Now, I decided to leave it as a 2% solution, but it was also a journey where you come across these incredible and astounding facts that the book is packed full of. Some of these facts are so long that I couldn't commit them to memory, and so I had to make a little laminated card to actually remind me of them. The uninsured today in America, the numbers of the uninsured, are equal to the combined populations of Oklahoma, Connecticut, Iowa, Mississippi, Kansas, Arkansas, Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, West Virginia, Nebraska, Idaho, Maine, New Hampshire, Hawaii, Rhode Island, Montana, Delaware, North Dakota, South Dakota, Alaska, Vermont, and Wyoming. Now, does anyone think that if we took the uninsured and segregated them in 24 states, nearly half the union, that as a nation, I mean the richest nation on the planet, we would condemn half the union to using the emergency room for primary care, making people wait 10 months or a year to get a biopsy if someone says in the emergency room that they have a problem? I don't think so, and yet that's been national policy for decades. So what I was trying to do as I made the rounds is to find a way that we might be able to reframe the national debate in a way that could persuade people really across the spectrum that we need a fresh start and a new way to think about our collective possibilities on some of these problems that have been lingering. The 2% solution is the package that I've arrived at. I'd like to persuade you and your friends and colleagues here and outside this room and across the country that this is the way the public debate needs to go. And here's the pitch. Suppose I told you that for 2 cents on the national dollar, we could have a country where every American had health coverage, every full-time worker earned a living wage, every poor child had a great teacher in a fixed-up school, and politicians didn't need to spend so much time groveling to wealthy donors. Suppose I added we would achieve these liberal-sounding goals largely through conservative-sounding means, like tax subsidies for health coverage, like market-based compensation for teachers, even bigger voucher trials, and that when the dust cleared, government would be smaller than it was when Ronald Reagan was president. Now, my wager is most people would say, and I have a poll I commissioned for the book that backs this up, well, that sounds intriguing. For 2 cents on the dollar, that sounds intriguing. I would like to hear more. Now, then I have to explain 2 cents on the national dollar means 2% of national income, or GDP, which next year will be about $220 billion a year, orders of magnitude beyond the boundaries of current domestic debate. Now, if you listen to the folks who set the terms of that debate, the politicians, the mainstream media, the way they interact, the usual talking heads you see on the tube, you'd say it's impossible. If you listen to common sense, I'm arguing, people will still say, well, it's 2 cents on the dollar. If this stuff is pragmatically doable for that, I would still like to hear more. So between our proper common sense intuition that 2% is a small number, and the Washington consensus that a 2% shift in national resources and priorities is beyond imagining, lies a chasm in which most of the quote-unquote solutions on offer from leaders on all sides amounts to a charade. And the way we're conducting public life around these issues is a kind of a hoax. Things don't have to be this way. The 2% solution aims to show how if we take 2 cents on the dollar in ideologically androgynous ways that I tease out, we can make dramatic progress against these problems in ways that are broadly acceptable, pragmatic, and just. Now, the kicker to the argument is if it seems a little audacious or outside the box, it has to be, because the baby boomers start to retire in less than 10 years. When they do, they will drain away all the cash and political energy to do anything but cope with their colossal health and pension costs. So if you think it's hard to get a discussion going now about 44 million uninsured, that's the number as of about a week ago, 44 million uninsured, 10 million of these urban kids, 15 million people living in poverty despite living in homes headed by full-time workers. And as people in this room know, it's hard to get traction on any of these debates. Starting a decade from now, it becomes politically and fiscally close to impossible. Now, these are problems that, in my view, take federal cash to help fix, cash that is mistakenly viewed as unaffordably liberal under existing terms of debate, but which as a practical matter are going to be hard to direct to these priorities if we don't build them into our vision of American society in advance now before the baby boomer crunch hits. Now, how unserious are we today about these problems? Here's all I think you need to know. In the last decade, the economy has grown by about 40% in real terms. Yet the problems we're talking about, if anything, have worsened, and serious talk of addressing them has all but vanished. Our shrinking ambition is depressingly measurable. Take your mind back to 1992, when George Bush's father, President Bush I, proposed a health care plan on defense. This was after Harris Wofford won the special election in Pennsylvania, if some of you may remember. Health care was hot. The Bush White House thought it had to have a health care plan out to cover its politics. And so Bush put out a plan that, when phased in, would have covered 30 million of the then 35 million uninsured. And my party, the Democrats, said that's too little too late. We're going to get our guy in and do it on our terms. And tragically, that didn't work out, as we know. But Bush the father was at 30 out of 35. Flash forward to today, 2004, the outer limits of President George W. Bush's compassion, and remember, he's the compassionate Bush, is a plan that, generously looked at, would reach 4 million of the now 44 million uninsured. Father at 30 out of 35, son is now at 4 out of 44. Meanwhile, no serious contender for the Democratic presidential nomination would stand behind Richard Nixon's combined plans for universal health coverage and a minimum family income, because Nixon's package from the early 1970s is way too liberal for the mainstream Democratic Party today. And at the same time, both parties are debating how and when to eliminate the estate tax, the bulk of whose burden falls on the richest 3,000 families in America. Now, I look at these facts and I ask, what has happened to our political will to address the problems facing ordinary Americans? And I think the short answer is simple. Since 1994, when the Clinton health care plan went down in a fiasco that cost Democrats control of Congress, Democrats have been afraid to think big again. Their voices are in the book. You'll hear them. The lesson they learned, the searing political lesson of that 94 loss, is that it was just too dangerous to try and lead public opinion. The most you could hope to do was to accompany public opinion, to follow public opinion. You could not lead it. Republicans, emboldened by this Democratic timidity, have pushed harder on their traditional priorities of cutting taxes and cutting regulations. What's been lost in this dysfunctional debate in the last decade is what ought to be a long-standing American commitment to these two ideals: equal opportunity and a minimally decent life for citizens of a wealthy nation, the kinds of things we'd be driven to if we took luck seriously in the way I was trying to suggest at the outset. Now, in my view, that means that domestic debate today urgently needs to be recentered around a handful of fundamental goals on which all of us can agree, whether we call ourselves Democrats or Republicans or independents. There will always be disagreements over the details. But if we ask, what does equal opportunity and a decent life mean in America in the 21st century, can't we agree every citizen ought to have basic health coverage? That full-time work ought to enable a family to live in some minimally decent way? That we ought to make special efforts as a country to make sure that schools for poor children are good? And that average citizens ought to have some way to have their voice heard amidst the din of big political money. The whole aim of the 2% solution is to persuade you that these are problems that have solutions that are affordable, practical, and within reach, and that can be embraced by both liberals and conservatives. Indeed, I argue we have to find ways that both sides can come together on this, because in my view, political power is going to remain closely divided in the years ahead. We're basically a 50-50 country now. I think that's going to remain that way in the years going forward. And that leaves us two choices. We either find some way to come together to get serious about these problems, or we go on pretending to solve them, which is what we've been doing, and kick them down the road until they fester and at some point explode in ways that I think no American should want to see as the outcome. Now, the case I make for how we can get serious about these problems is pretty simple. There's three basic propositions. The first is, we can't solve these problems without money. My conservative friends are right, money is not everything, but for the problems we're talking about, it's a lot. You cannot buy health insurance without money. You cannot lift poor workers out of poverty without money. I'm not talking about the undeserving poor. We can move that debate aside. I'm talking about poor workers. You can't lift them out of poverty without money. You cannot attract a better caliber college graduate to teach in our toughest urban schools without money. And you cannot offset the influence of big political donations in our system without money. So the first proposition is it takes money. The second proposition is we have the money. And here I ask you to consider two numbers, 22 and 20. Federal spending as a share of GDP, share of the size of the economy, is the best rough proxy for the size of government when it comes to spending. Under Ronald Reagan and George Bush I, federal spending averaged 22% of GDP. Under Bill Clinton, federal spending averaged 20% of GDP in ways that the press never explained properly and that the public therefore really doesn't understand. We balanced the budget and then unbalanced it downward in terms of the size of the federal government vis-a-vis the size of the U.S. economy. Now, George W. Bush's plan is that even after epic defense increases, after some increases obviously in Homeland Security after 9/11, and after budgeting for a chunk at least of a new prescription drug benefit for Medicare, Bush plans after all that to hold spending around 20% of GDP in the years ahead because, in his words, we have, quote, met our needs. We have not met our needs when we have 44 million uninsured and 10 million of these urban kids and all these working poor, et cetera. The point of the 22 and 20 is that 2 cents on the national dollar can get us a long way toward real answers on these problems and leave us with a government as small or smaller than we were accustomed to under a conservative Republican icon like Ronald Reagan. And it wouldn't be, that's assuming that we would do it all through tax increases. The plan that I propose is about half repealing some of the Bush tax cuts and other tax increases, and half spending cuts and reallocations of current federal spending. So we can do all that and end up smaller than we were under Ronald Reagan. So it takes money, we have the money. The third proposition is there's a deal to be made. And the bulk of the book tries to lay out a series of what I call grand bargains on health care, on education, on wages, on campaign finance, and more, that shows, in the book, tries to show these kind of negotiations between leaders on both sides of the aisle and the kinds of people who would have to implement these deals, that there's a way to bring them together around the kind of deals that would move us forward. Thematically, each of the bargains is basically the same. The left or liberal side of the debate has to be open to more market-friendly approaches to these problems, as opposed to just a direct extension of existing government programs. But in exchange, the right has to be willing to pony up the money equal to the magnitude of the problem. So no more George W. Bush plans that reach 4 million uninsured when there's 44. Now, the good news is these deals are doable, and I try and show in all these chapters, if you have a look at it, our leaders, when they're not in front of the camera lights, in what seems like the unnatural act nowadays of actually negotiating their way towards some kind of compromise and deal to achieve a common goal. The bad news is, at least when it comes to the party's public posturing, is that our two major political parties are organized around ideologies and interest groups that, in my view, systematically ban the expression of a common-sense blend of liberal and conservative thinking. And so the result is that we're left with what I call a solutions gap in public life, where we all see what's going on the TV and we hear the shouting back and forth, and we know, if you're like me, you yell back pathetically at the TV, even though that's kind of a sorry thing to do, but you can't resist. But we know that we're not getting a discussion that's equal to what the problems are. The cycle of cynicism and disillusionment only deepens, and you can't really blame citizens, because how else should people react when it's clear that neither political party has a political strategy, that is, a strategy for winning elections and acquiring power that actually includes solving our biggest domestic problems. Now, the case I make for how we can get past this bipartisan make-believe is pretty straightforward. Usually today, when our leaders try and take on problems, they try and find proposals they can offer that bring their interest groups and ideological allies and donors and political pals with them. That's not a criticism of politicians necessarily, it's just a description of the way politics works. Now, the beauty of that approach is that there's always a built-in constituency for the pseudo-answer that you develop. The downside, of course, is it's a pseudo-answer. And how many education presidents do we want to have while the schools for our neediest kids get worse? How many health care plans while the number of uninsured rise? We've been trying it this way for years. The different way that I try and urge in the book, and that I try and urge citizens to become a constituency for, because that's the only thing that actually changes what we get from our leaders, is when there's a constituency for it, is to really just look at the problems head on. Because if you look at some of these things and say, what's the best way to make progress on this, you always find it's a kind of pragmatic blend of ideas from left and right and whatever, because you're just trying to figure out what works. You're not trying to pass some litmus test or ideological hoop that our leaders feel constrained to go through today to be able to bring their allies along. Let me give you two quick concrete examples of the kind of proposals I'm talking about in the book, and we can discuss more if you want in the discussion period. The first has to do with schools for poor children. Now, there's probably 100 things we ought to do for these kids and their families. There's some things, if we're honest, we can never do in terms of the family life because that's something that's beyond government's reach. That's something the community can't affect that much. But there's probably 10 big things you could do for the schools themselves. But if you could do just one thing, I'm convinced from all the reporting and research I've done with experts across the aisle and educators and the like, the one thing we would focus on is teacher quality. Teacher quality, because that's the thing that has the most influence on the progress that these kids, these luckless children, can make outside the family that they come from. Now, the tragedy today, and the union leaders, the teachers' union leaders will be the first to explain this and weep over it, is that we are recruiting for our toughest schools from the bottom third of the college class. This was not the case a generation ago. Up through the 1960s and mid-1970s, the quality of the teacher corps in urban America was subsidized, frankly, by discrimination, because women and minorities didn't have as many opportunities outside the classroom. So that we're now, that generation is on the cusp of retirement. Sandy Feldman, the head of the American Federation of Teachers, one of the biggest unions in the country, will say, as it says in the book, that we're about to lose an enormous talent pool as that crop of teachers who came in during that period in the last generation are really going to be retiring in the next few years. And their younger counterparts are not going into teaching today. They're becoming doctors and lawyers and business executives and dot-com executives, et cetera. Now, if you look at the typical urban district and you look at its nearby affluent suburb, what you find is that when you look at the schools, the suburbs pay more, the suburbs have much nicer working conditions, if you've been around some of our urban schools, and the suburbs have kids who come to school with far fewer problems than the kids who come in the big cities where they've got a host of the kind of dysfunction that we know exists with poverty. And that makes them easier to teach. So when you compare the nearby suburbs and the inner cities, it shouldn't surprise us that over time, the best teachers in the national teacher pool gravitate to the best suburban schools. Now, this is not to diminish the work of thousands and thousands of great teachers who are working their hearts out in these urban schools on behalf of these kids, but it's teachers like that who have told me with passion how mediocre and unqualified so many of their colleagues are and how they are blighting the lives of so many of these children. So that we have situations like, I know in LA, I know in New York, I imagine it's true in San Diego, you can have kids go from kindergarten through 6th grade every year with a brand new, green, untrained, underqualified rookie. And all the research tells us that after a couple of years of that, and these are kids who start off behind the 8 ball, after a couple of years of that, these kids can never catch up. I mean, what could be more unjust? Now, what would we do about this if we were serious? For starters, I believe we would not be resting on the laurels of the so-called No Child Left Behind law that President Bush enacted in the first year, in which Democrats, Ted Kennedy, led the effort to have the Democrats come together and shake hands with George Bush on the White House lawn so that Karl Rove next year will spend $200 million blasting those images to help sell the idea that President Bush is compassionate. I believe that law did next to nothing to affect the teacher quality issue that I'm talking about, that is at the heart of what we would do if we were serious. It did some good things, happy to talk about it if you want in discussion, a few good things, but by and large punted entirely on the teacher quality problem. Mrs. Bush does some very good bully pulpit work. She was a teacher herself. She's urging people to go into teaching. But a bully pulpit approach to urge people to go into teaching when we face the market dynamics, if you compare what the conditions are like and the salary trajectories in urban schools, simply doesn't suffice. It's not serious. The Democrats, if you look at what they're proposing, they know they need to do something better. They're a little readier to spend money, but they're still not proposing things equal to the problem. Richard Gephardt, for example, John Edwards are talking about things like a teacher corps where we'd forgive some college tuition for kids who agree to teach in these toughest schools for a few years. It's better than nothing. It's a nice idea, but again, it's not equal to the problem we're facing, where we know we need to hire 2 million teachers in the next decade, 700,000 in these high-poverty schools, and nothing we're talking about yet is anything that would add up to something that changed an engineering graduate's incentive to take a $50,000 or $60,000 job that he can get in a high-tech firm and trade that for $35,000 at the local school. So what would we do if we were serious? In my book, what I argue is that a president, the nation, something at the national level, a president would come to the country and say, I'm going to raise the salaries of high-poverty teachers 50% across the board. But that increase is conditioned on 2 fundamental reforms from the teachers' unions. First, the unions have to scrap the Lockstep pay scale. Do people know what that is? Right now, most unions require in these big districts that you pay somebody, a teacher, based just on the number of years they have in class and whether they have a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, et cetera, so that we're required to pay a physics teacher who's got 8 years in class basically the same as a phys ed teacher who's got 8 years in class. And that's not to diminish the good work that may be being done by the phys ed teacher, but it is to say that that's part of what accounts for why we have these severe shortages in math teachers, science teachers, special ed, places where when young people have that kind of background in education, they have more lucrative options outside the classroom. So the unions have to scrap that lockstep pay scale so I can raise the top half of teachers another 50% on average, the top half of performers as well as these shortage specialties. And then they have to scrap the rules that make it next to impossible to fire the worst performing teachers today, who even the union leaders will say, as they do in the book, are blighting the lives of up to 10% of these kids. Now, under a deal like this, in a city like Los Angeles, where I live, I imagine the numbers in San Diego may be a little bit different, but basically the same conceptually. The starting salary in LA today is $40,000 for a teacher. It maxes out after 25 years, if you've managed to pick up a PhD along the way somehow on nights and weekends and summers, maxes out around $75,000. Under my plan, the starting salary would be $60,000. The top half of performers and these shortage specialties would average $85,000 to $90,000. The best teachers, not every teacher, but the best teachers would earn $130,000, $140,000, even $150,000. The goal would be to have the nation make a commitment that we're going to make the best teachers of poor children millionaires over their careers. In other words, able to put aside enough in savings at those rates that by the time they retired, they could put $1 million in the bank from what they'd earned. I believe that only a change on this scale will change what we need to change, which is the way college students look at teaching as a career when they're figuring out how to spend their lives. Now, this plan would cost $30 billion a year. And I am happy to report that's one of the smaller ticket items in my 2% solution. Now, $30 billion is a 7% increase in national K-12 spending. It would create, I believe, a 1,000% revolution in the way the career of teaching is viewed by the kids whose choices we're trying to affect. So that's the teacher idea in the book. As you can see, I'm asking the left to give up, via the teachers' unions, some of their traditional practices. I'm asking the right to put up money equal to the size of the problem. Just briefly on the health care idea I propose. The plan for health care I propose is what I call the Bill Bradley, George Bush Sr. health care plan. Now, why do I call it that? Remember I said that George Bush Sr. had an underappreciated plan that he offered in 1992. It was almost the same in terms of its design as the one Bill Bradley put out in the 2000 presidential primaries when Al Gore attacked it as a wild-eyed utopian liberal dream. This is basically the plan that Bush had put out in 92 that was too little too late. And Gore trashed it as evidence of Bradley's reckless spending mentality. Now, both Bradley and Bush Sr. offered a plan that would basically have refundable tax credits, a kind of voucher or subsidy, targeted to the working poor and their families because they make up about 80% of the uninsured, that would put the cash in the hands of those families to buy a decent family policy from among competing private insurers, regulated in ways that assure they're in a pool so they get affordable group rates. You can't be left out in the individual market, as people understand. If you're sick and unwell, you can't get insurance then. But that kind of a plan, in my view, which has been developed by conservative think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, Democratic groups like the Democratic Leadership Council and other groups over the last dozen years, espoused publicly by President Bush I and Bill Bradley, is, in my view, the kind of way we could move toward an American-style universal coverage that would finally put this shame of having the population of 24 states outside the system. So as you can see, and I'm happy to go through in discussion some of the other ideas like this that have to do with wages and campaign finance if you're interested, but I'm asking for a kind of attitude change on the part of everyone in debate to help us get serious about this. And in one sense, I'm asking us to engage in the unnatural act, at least in the way our modern public discourse works, of acknowledging what is right in the other side's worldview. So you'll see me sing the praises of Milton Friedman. Though I'm a liberal, I'm singing the praises of Milton Friedman in the book for some of the different insights he's had. And the big wage subsidy that I propose in the book that would get us to a real living wage builds on ideas he had in the 1950s that were called the negative income tax when he first created it, that later became what we now call the earned income tax credit, that now spends about $35 billion a year as a wage supplement to the working poor, and that I would expand and build upon to get to the kind of living minimum wage of between $9 and $10 an hour, that doesn't put the full burden of that on employers, because you can't do that and have it be economically rational. So I'm asking folks to consider what's right in the other side's worldview. I'm asking each side of the debate to give up some of their cherished hobby horses and ways of arguing that are really destructive in terms of the debate. I'm asking my Republican friends, for example, to give up the big government mantra that Democrats are assailed with come election time. And what I say to my conservative friends is, when they talk about big government, is that just 7 things make up 75% of what the federal government does. Those 7 things are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, military pensions, civil service pensions, defense, and interest on the national debt. Those 7 things are 75% of the federal government. Republicans are not trying to cut a dime of that. Republicans are proposing big increases in all of those things. Republicans under President Bush's budget will double the national debt and the interest on the debt in just the next few years. So if you look, oh, and sorry, and that's before you get to the last 25%, which contains everything that we really think of as government, from the National Institutes of Health, people want cures for cancer, to NASA, it's had some problems, but people basically support NASA, to student loans, to farm subsidies, homeland security. All of those things take up a goodly portion of the quarter on the dollar that's left, and conservatives vote for those things every day. So I ask my Republican friends, I understand the politics of why they attack on big government, but if you look at how they vote, and you compare it to their rhetoric, the attack on so-called big government is a pure pretense. I ask my Democratic friends to challenge some of the things that they hold dear. One example is the teachers' unions. The teachers' unions, as you know, are perhaps the strongest interest group in the Democratic Party. They send more people to the Democratic nominating convention for the presidency than the state of California does. But I'm asking the Democrats to talk to the unions about how to change their practices. The conservatives are right when they say if you have to pay everybody exactly the same, throwing this magnitude of money in doesn't make sense. You have to change the practices to make it possible to use the new money more effectively. I'm also asking Democrats and liberals to be open to the idea that it's the left that has to take the lead on slowing the growth of health care costs as the baby boomers age, if there's going to be any room in the federal budget for anything besides health care and pensions for seniors. What I say to my more liberal friends is that a decade from now, the enemies of the left is not going to be the heirs of Newt Gingrich. It's going to be Medicare. And when I say that, it's because every dollar that's going to Medicare that's not needed for quality care, and remember, we're spending as a nation 14% of GDP on health care. Everybody else is spending 9%. They cover everybody. We have 44 million out. We don't have demonstrably better health outcomes, so we have radical inefficiency in our health care system. Every dollar that goes to Medicare a decade from now that's not needed for quality care is a dollar that liberals can't spend on a poor child. And that's the way the budget trade-offs are going to look starting a decade from now, because as the boomers age, these programs for seniors are going to gobble up more and more and more of the federal budget. I'm asking the press to rethink its role. I'm happy to talk in Q&A about the concrete innovations I propose for page 1 of the Washington Post and the New York Times as the 2 most influential bulletin boards in our political culture. What goes on those 2 pages every day has an enormous influence on what TV does, what all the other newspapers do, and I think that the press isn't doing the job it could do to help make the world safer for the kind of discussions I'm suggesting we need to have. And finally, I'm asking all of us as citizens to become a little more engaged in these questions so that we can change the course of the whole domestic debate. You know, we hear all the time about the crisis of leadership we face, the crisis of leadership. It's a kind of daily lament, and I know there's a lot of truth to that. But if we're honest, we also have to admit that we suffer from a crisis of followership and citizenship, because in my view at least, democracy is a two-way street. We largely get the government we deserve, and that iron law of politics still holds. Politicians will scramble to lead any parade that forms. And that's not a diminishing thing to say about politicians. That's the way democracy works. And so the task of citizenship in a democracy is to organize the right parades. And so that means that all of us have to become at least a little more engaged on some threshold level if we want to expect any different results. That doesn't mean I'm saying that busy moms and dads have to, you know, tuck the kids into bed at night and then study up deeply on domestic policy. Though if they're interested, I have the one book I think that would be useful in that regard. But we are going to all have to do a little more if we want to make the world safe for our leaders to feel they can step outside those ideological and litmus tests that they feel imposed on them and feel as a real constraint on their freedom of action. So there's a lot of hope in the book because if you look at it, you'll see these deals are negotiated with the kind of people who would have to make them happen in the real world. There was, to be sure, no shortage of naysaying as I went around the country the last few years that, this sounds great, but it can't happen. The unions won't do it, the business won't get behind it, the politicians won't risk it, you can't reallocate the money. And I know this skepticism makes perfect sense given the poverty of our debate in recent years. But in the broad scheme of things, the changes I'm talking about are literally small change. And when a country is just 2 cents on the dollar away from social justice and more economic growth, if we bring all this human capital into the mainstream where it belongs, then I think there's plenty of grounds for hope, especially if all of us commit to making a little extra effort to helping become a constituency that demands of our leaders fresher talk about these kind of problems. Thank you.
Wow. Reasonably thoughtful, wouldn't you say? I think it's just amazing. This guy has devoted so much time and effort. And how much better off we would be as a society if more of us did the same. The book is the 2% Solution, and it's going to be available for sale and for signing. And we're going to have Q&A. Before we get to that, I just want to point out something I neglected to. We're actually meeting here in this magnificent new Point Loma Library. Isn't it fantastic? But every time we do one of these Great American Writer Series events in one of our new libraries, it reminds me that we have not yet built the crown jewel of the system, which is a new downtown San Diego library. We must accomplish that. I hope in my lifetime. I would just love to see that happen. I'll start the first question. I'm just intrigued about something. I read a column, I think Joe Conason in the New York Observer, who said that Richard Nixon was the last great liberal president. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think sadly that's become kind of a cliche now, and it's a kind of indication of where we are. When I talk to liberal groups around the country and talk about, I've been talking to liberal groups, conservative groups, business groups, education groups, etc. But with the liberal groups, I commiserate that our side's really in bad trouble when we're pointing to Richard Nixon as our domestic policy hero. But the truth was, under the tutelage of Pat Moynihan and others, was very progressive. He invented the EPA. He was talking about minimum family incomes, universal coverage. Ted Kennedy wishes he had taken that deal 30 years ago from Nixon on health coverage. So that's sort of where the center of gravity has gone.
Okay, from the floor. Yes, sir.
Could you say a bit more about your redesign of the Times and the Post front page?
You might
Yes.
want to repeat the question.
Sure. The question was, say a little bit more about my redesign of the front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post. My take, first on sort of the sort of diagnosis of what's wrong with the media or how we should think about the media is, we hear all this carping all the time about, from the right, that the media is liberal, the media is liberal, the media is liberal, and my own observation is I think that's largely right. Just based on personal observation, if you ask what are the personal political predilections of people in the national political press, I think they lean left. But I don't think that's interesting. What's interesting is if the press is so liberal, why has the political center of gravity moved so far to the right in the country in the last 2 decades? And I think the answer to that is that the coverage of our most influential outlets is dictated not by ideology, but by stenography. And when I say that, some of my press friends get upset. I don't mean it as a pejorative, but just as a pure description. News, quote unquote, on the issues that we're talking about on public policy is defined by what public officials say and do. And so you have the mainstream Republican position and the mainstream Democratic position, and the 50-yard line in American politics is between them. That's faithfully reflected by the press, who in a stenographic way reports on that. So before 1994, for example, the Democrats were over here talking about health coverage for everyone and more money for the working poor through the EITC, et cetera. The Republicans are here, 50-yard lines in the middle. After 94, the Democrats went like this, got scared to death. The Republicans saw that and said, wow, we can go here. And let's talk about eliminating the death tax and scrapping the capital gains tax and shaving the dividend tax. And so the 50-yard line moved over here, even though it's all reflected through the quote-unquote liberal media. So what I wanted to do and that the press is so important to the way the whole public discussion gets shaped, especially these top outlets, I wanted to find a way to, I guess, answer my own frustration. I mean, when I was in business in a prior life and then worked in government, I would be frustrated, perhaps you share this sometimes, I'd say, how come the New York Times doesn't do more on the uninsured or the working poor or, these things I care about? Once I descended into journalism, I realized that and you started to imbibe what the ethic was of the way news could responsibly be covered, if there's not news on these issues, which means there's not official action, a governor's not proposing something, a presidential candidate or a president isn't doing something, there's no million-man march, if there's not news, these outlets aren't going to do a two-part series on this stuff every month, and they can all the quality outlets can point to the three-part series they did on the uninsured 14 months ago that was a finalist for this award, and the two-part series they did on that family that works but is in poverty. But if there's no action, there's no news. So what I wanted to propose wasn't there some way that these outlets could still regularize attention to the things that remain important even when there's not news on them for various reasons? Because as we all know, what's new isn't the same as what's important. What's important doesn't change day to day. But could you do that in a way that still honored the press's own sense of how it would responsibly exercise its power? And so what I come up, and there's a mock-up of it in the book, and the chapter on the press is all hooked around a long interview with Len Downey, the editor of the Washington Post, to whom I pitched this idea, as well as his counterparts at the New York Times, Bill Keller, and others, is a feature at the bottom of page 1 that's just 2 lines that I call "Still True Today." And that feature, "Still True Today," would be a little 2-line ticker tape. So the whole front page is still basically what it is. I tell them I'm only asking for 2% of the front page. And in that, if I were Donald Graham, who owns the Post, or I were the Salzburger family, who own the Times, Monday would be Health Day, and it would, still true today. 44 million uninsured, U.S. spends 14% of GDP, everyone spends 9%, Medicare doesn't cover prescription drugs. Tuesday might be Education Day. 2 million teachers need to be hired in the next decade, starting salary averages $30,000, et cetera. Wednesday would be Working Poor Day, and so on. But each Monday, when healthcare came around, you'd run those same facts. The idea would be try to emblazon that basic knowledge. Now, when I talked to Len Downey of the Post, and this is the whole chapter is based on an interview with him, and I said, things like just asking, how often do you talk about the facts of the uninsured? It doesn't seem like it's that often. And he, in a somewhat grumbly way, said, what do you mean? That fact is part of the basic background of every healthcare story we do, et cetera, et cetera. I'd say, how often has it been on the front page? And he would bristle and say, well, the front page is a news decision. I'm not going to put it on the front page just because you say so. And so I went back and looked. How often was just the fact of the 40-ish million uninsured on page 1 of the Washington Post between George Bush's inauguration, January 20th, 2001, and September 10th of that year, which was my cutoff for obvious reasons. And the uninsured, that fact about the uninsured was never on the front page. Maybe it was inside 10 or 12 times. During that same period, the Gary Condit Chandra Levy story had 187 pieces in the Post and 15 front-page stories, et cetera, and obviously no one would, a fair-minded person would weigh them in the balance as equally important. So when I proposed, I wouldn't whip out my mock-up of the new Washington Post page 1 with this thing at the bottom until I had had a discussion first about how they exercise the power, how they decide what goes on page 1. And you'll see why that's important in a sec. Because they would say, first, some things are just hard news that happens. A bomb goes off in Baghdad, the State of the Union address, that's page 1. Then there's the kind of offbeat, well-told story, the kind of thing, if you know Rick Bragg, when he was at the New York Times before he had his stringer problem, would write a story about Louisiana gumbo, and there'd be a good photograph and color they can do now to merchandise the front page. But then there's often, as everyone knows, a 3-part series that's where they've sent off a team of reporters, investigative reporters or explanatory reporters, to go off and do a big series on how the IRS audits poorer people more than richer people, or how there was a famous Washington Post series that Kate Poo did that won a Pulitzer on abuses in homes for the mentally ill. And Downey and other editors of both these papers would say that's an exercise, they would define it as an exercise of power, assigning that resource, putting it on front page of these powerful newspapers, knowing it's going to affect the public debate. So when I showed them the thing at the bottom, and the general reaction from all these editors was, that's too editorial. Then I would say, it was after we had this other discussion, I would say, how is it different from the discretionary power you say you exercise when you send a team off to do, these other stories, that even if you're not doing it to set an agenda, does end up setting an agenda, et cetera. And there's a whole discussion of all this in the book. The way, after a couple of quips, people like Jeff Greenfield said to me, still true today, cats are more popular than dogs. You know, there's 100 things I could put in here that are still true today. And Len Downey said at one point, you know, I can put in here the latest thing about chocolate. I love chocolate. But at the end, when you're serious, when I said, what's the difference between what you're doing that you say is power and what I'm talking about, even though I know it's more accountable, that I realize, he would say, it doesn't come organically out of the coverage of the news. And I thought that's a phrase that journalism seminars could chew over for years, because it all depends on that Clinton-esque cliche of what do you mean by organically, coverage, and news. And, but that, at least they engaged on it. The Columbia Journalism Review is doing a cover excerpt of this section next month, which I hope will deepen a debate in the profession before the 2004 election about what they might be able to do. The Sacramento Bee is already thinking about doing this on the editorial page, I'm told, and it'd be nice to have this debate about the role the press could play now instead of the kind of hand-wringing that usually happens after the election when they say we were barking up the wrong tree, et cetera.
This is the last question, which has to do with our state. Fifth largest economy in the world. We're in a state of disarray. I saw Arthur Schlesinger at the Paris Review Party Tuesday night. He said, you live in a crazy state. Well, I don't know. But tell us how you think this new governor is going to be able to deal with all of these challenges.
Well, the short answer is I don't know. I'm as curious as anyone to see what he's actually going to propose, because he gave no indication during the campaign. I'm actually trying to be hopeful because, as I said at the beginning, if he governed like a Rockefeller Republican, he could really change the nature of what Republican Party is viewed as in the state and the country. And meanwhile, I know I need to start working on a kind of 2% variation for California because some of the ideas could apply. I mean, we're the size of a country, and so I need to do some adapting of that. But as for Arnold, we'll have to wait and see.
Do you think that the governor-elect will be successful in groping with our future?
I hope so.
That was too
He
bad.
likes these lines, right?
Listen, hasn't this been terrific? This guy is just great.